I believe so.
She just went to drop clear right now, so she'll be right back. Here she is. Is that where they were? Or? Oh, okay. I heard, yeah. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Bridgehampton School. My name is Mary Kelly, and I'm the very proud superintendent of the Bridgehampton School District. I'm very pleased to be able to welcome you to our school for a very special night. And it's the culmination of a collaboration with the Hayground School, the Bridgehampton Child Care and Recreation Center, and the Bridgehampton School to host an event for our families and communities, an evening with Alfie Kohn. I am certain that you're going to enjoy an engaging and informative evening here tonight. At this time, I would like to thank our partners from the Hayground School, Mr. Arjun Achyutham and Ms. Marcel Longendahl, our partner from the Bridgehampton Child Care and Recreation Center, Ms. Bonnie Cannon, as well as members of our Bridgehampton team. Our school administrators, Principal Mr. Michael Miller and Assistant Principal Mr. Michael Cox, who helped coordinate this evening's event. Our E&L educator, Ms. Nympha Boyd, who will be providing translation services for tonight's event. And our school counselor, who's up in the loft, Mr. Ryan Barker, who is here tonight to provide technical support and make this a very well-run evening. And I also want to take an opportunity to thank our custodial staff who are always working so diligently to make sure that our school is prepared for all of our events. So without further ado, at this time it is my pleasure to introduce Hayground School founder and educator, Mr. Arjun Achyutham.
Choice in what they study, and that engages them more. And it was great because we had representatives from 6 schools in this area, which was really nice, as well as the staff at the really excited to have Alfie here tonight. For those of you who don't know Alfie, lives in the Boston area. He's the author of 14 books on various education topics, as well as numerous essays, which we've read many of. And he's been published in the Journal of Education, Ladies' Home Journal, The Nation, Harvard Business Review, and has appeared on hundreds of radio and television programs, including Today Show and Oprah. And he started out as a teacher himself, which gives him lots of credit. So, without further ado, Alfie Kohn.
Hello, do we have sound? Yes? Yes? Oh, that's excellent. Thank you so much for showing up on a Friday night, and thank you too for masking, which I really appreciate, keeping one another safe, and also allowing me, if you don't mind, to unmask while I speak, because you're masking, and also we have some distance, which helps as well. If you forgot to bring one and forgot to pick one up, I certainly will not think it rude at all if you choose to go back over near the door to get one, much as we might wish that this tiresome and fearsome pandemic was behind us already, going on 3 years. It is not. It just keeps mutating as if to deliberately teach our kids how evolution works, which is a useful teachable moment, but perhaps one might imagine one that's a little less dangerous to the rest of us. Anyway, I want to get a sense of who you are because it will inform my remarks tonight. I see some faces I recognize, but how many were at the presentation I did this afternoon? Okay, a little less than half. Thank you. How many of you are here primarily in your capacity as parents? Okay. And safe to say the rest of you are educators of one type or another? Yes? Okay. How many of you are educators or parents affiliated with a public school, such as Bridgehampton, for example, or other? Okay. How many of you are parents of or teachers of kids who are elementary age or younger? And of middle or high school students? Okay, so divides right halfway down the middle. All right, very useful. So often I like to begin my presentation by citing some research and asking people, as I did this afternoon, to try to figure out why the results might have come out the way they did. The idea being that real learning requires the people the teacher is working with to actively construct meaning rather than merely to passively absorb information. That's true for kids, but it's also true for adults as well, which is why I continue to grind my teeth to stubs at what passes for professional development in many school districts, which is basically an ongoing example of how not to teach, where you just sit there and listen to somebody. Tonight, instead of starting with a study, I want to start with an actual vignette, a scene from a real classroom. Happens to be in Massachusetts, my home state. Ideally, it would be great if we could all go in person and sit together and watch a classroom where the kinds of things I'm describing take place and then talk about it later. Second choice would be if I had some video of what I'm about to describe, but we're left with our imagination, choice number 3. So I'm going to describe what happened over a period of 3 days and ask you to pretend that we're actually watching, that we're viewing this conversation. So this takes place with in a first grade classroom. And the kids are learning about the Mayflower as part of the history lesson over some period of time. This being New England, the Mayflower, of course, is the ship that a whole lot of people pretend their ancestors came over on. If that were true of everyone who made that claim, it would have held 800,000 people. But they're learning what the Mayflower did. And one morning, as the kids get to school, they notice that all the chairs and tables have been pushed to the sides of the room, and in the vast expanse, as it certainly seems to a 6-year-old, of the floor, is the outline of a ship in masking tape, which creates a kind of buzz of expectation and curiosity about what's going on. And when all the kids have arrived, the teacher explains that this is the Mayflower that we've been learning about. And then she cues one of their classmates by the name of Zeb, who comes in dressed in the appropriate period garb by arrangement, and unrolls a scroll, which he announces is from the king, and proceeds to read, "You can't sail on the ship until you know how big it is." "Thank you, Zeb," says the teacher. "So we have to find out the size of this ship. Does anybody have any ideas?" Silence. The kind of silence that a teacher dreads while eating breakfast sometimes when she's prepared a project like this. Is there anything that we can do? Finally, one kid raises his hand and says, "We can figure out the size of the ship because we know it's not 3 feet. Because the nurse measured me, and I'm 4 feet, and the ship's bigger than me." This cues up other kids to toss in ideas as well now. And one kid suggests that it might be possible to measure the ship in terms of how many times he can fit in it, and proceeds to say that it is 4 or so toms long. Problem solved. Wait a minute, says the teacher. The king has never met Tom. How will he know what that means? And she waits for somebody to say, "Well, he just told us he's 4 feet tall," and nobody says it. Does the teacher supply this bit of information that the kids have unexpectedly forgotten? She does not. Like some of the best teachers I've ever met, she has teeth marks on her tongue. Now someone suggests, a different kid, what if we measure it with our hands? All the kids gather around, this seems kind of fun, and the kid who suggested it measures it with his hands, and does it several times and gets a different answer each time, until somebody else says you got to start right at the beginning and leave no space. Tries it a few more times, and now gets the same answer more than once. The boat is 36 hands long. We're done. That's great, says the teacher, except Cindy, she's the smallest kid in the class. Could you do it now with your hands? Uh-oh. Now the boat is 42 hands long. Chaos, animated discussion. The kids have learned that all hands on deck are not of equal size. By the time some kid finally says, well, we can try our feet, they have run out of time. I don't know why they've run out of time, but in many schools, the schedule takes precedence over the learning. Whether or not bells ring, everybody has to move on to music at a specified time, which makes it harder to do good teaching, which is why the best administrators make it easier to suspend the schedule when necessary. But in this case, they had to move on, and they come back the next day. The teacher, I don't think, had been planning to continue this lesson the next day. But we're not done, so we have no choice but to do so. But it turns out to be serendipitous. Good fortune, because giving the extra time overnight allow the kids to keep thinking about it. Also, the complete absence of homework promotes thinking, as well as health, social relationships, and other things. I'll come back to that a little later. But anyway, and overnight, a kid has had a brainstorm about this. He says, we can measure it with feet like we're talking about, but not my feet or anyone else's. We should measure it with Zeb's feet because the king knows Zeb. He gave him the note. Brilliant. They proceed to measure it in increments of Zeb feet, and then ask permission to measure a great deal of other things around the school in Zeb feet, which they do. And only after that, on the third day, does the teacher for the first time introduce the concept of a ruler, show it to them, and have them use that and introduce the concept of standard units of measurement. We've been watching this over 3 days at this school. So here's my question for you. What do you make of this Mayflower math lesson? Does it differ in important ways from the way math is usually taught at any grade? Does it differ from the way other subjects are typically taught in first grade? What, if anything, strikes you as remarkable or interesting about the way this math lesson was laid out? Would you do me a favor and find one person in this room you don't know? That may mean somebody sitting in a row or a couple of rows below you or above you. Feel free to stand up and say hello, introduce yourself quickly, and then trade observations about this Mayflower math lesson. And what about teaching and learning struck you as interesting in this lesson? Say hello. I invite you back. particular answer. I'm interested in anything that you and your partner noticed. Anybody? Can you summarize one observation, something you thought was interesting?
I
Yeah.
said one that you walk in and the furniture's moved and the outline all of a sudden right away before you've done anything is something that you think.
You get kids thinking already and engaged by that. Yes, yes, thank you. What else? Yes?
We made a few observations. One of them, in terms of the question, was just about the kids having curiosity and not being initially given that concept of that standardization.
Yes.
We also had, the question came up in terms of the example of the Mayflower, and in thinking about, the larger scope of what it means to be talking about progressive education, that we would have loved a context in terms of the Mayflower in relationship to colonization and, the experience of many indigenous people in this country.
Right, which perhaps happened when they originally learned about the Mayflower, freeing her up to look at the mathematical aspects of this, but yes, I take your point. So curiosity was aroused, you're saying, in part by the absence of simply providing the ruler at the beginning, just as arranging the furniture began to pique your curiosity before the lesson even began. Yes, thank you. Somebody else? Anything else? Yes?
It fostered teamwork because they all had to work together and it was inclusive of everyone, especially the teacher included the small one as well. And
Yes.
so it fostered teamwork.
It was collaborative, the education, as most of her lessons are. Not about, I want to see what you can do stranded on your own desk as if you're on your own private island.
It really demonstrated focus on problem-solving based learning.
Right.
And also, as the lesson went on, the students became more in control of the learning and had ownership of their learning.
And what about the lesson as I described it, do you think gave them that sense of ownership?
The fact that they really had to think outside the box, the fact that the information wasn't teacher directed, that
Yeah.
She was allowing them to chew on things and think about things, and allowing them to, as Bonnie said, collaborate with each other.
Collaborate and come up with the problem, solving on their own,
Right.
without looking for a right answer.
Right answer.
Yeah, so, and nor did she ever say, good job, I really like that, because praise, like other rewards, shuts down thinking. When you say good job to children, the point is no longer to think in an open-ended way, it's to get the approval of the person giving out the praise. It's just as bad as giving out A's or gold stars. It undermines real engagement and changes the objective from figuring this stuff out to getting a patronizing pat on the head and so on. But notice that she didn't just let them do it and stand back. She was involved, but involved in a kind of interesting way to provide that sense of ownership, which is that the teacher stepped in not to facilitate, which comes from the Latin facile, meaning to make easy, but rather to artfully complicate. The teacher got involved twice. Once to say, but the king hasn't met Tom, how will he know what that means? And the second time to invite someone with a different sized hand to try. What she's doing is throwing a monkey wrench in the gears, as Eleanor Duckworth put it, to force them to go back and reconstrue. This is what great teachers figure out, not just how to sweep them along, not to help them get the answer, but to make them have to rethink when they're capable of doing that. Anything else you noticed? Something that hasn't been brought up yet?
We had a lot of fun.
They had time in part because she made the time.
Yeah.
She had structural constraints in terms of her schedule, but she didn't plan to continue this over 3 days. And she said, we're not done. So the learning is the goal here. So she had that time.
And I would like to build on that evening, that night that they were separated and came back to.
Yeah.
Was a very fruitful time.
Which just happened unplanned.
They didn't need to be busy doing stuff, but their minds were.
Yeah, they were still working, which tends to happen for me, for other adults, for kids as well, as long as you don't clutter up by making them waste their evenings by doing worksheets, which is a great way of shutting down thinking, But yeah, and they came back with an idea that they didn't have then. Just like the artist steps away from the easel to get a sense of perspective. You get an idea when you weren't expecting it in the shower or driving or whatever. Anything else? Mm-hmm.
The teacher had confidence that the children could do it and gave them time to figure it out, which communicates to the kids that they are capable.
Right. That communicates support and encouragement more than praise. Praise is about good job for living up to my expectations and meeting my standards in a way I've decided. Well, what is fundamentally more powerfully supportive of autonomy and communicates that confidence is not just saying, didn't you hear me? I said he said he was 4 feet tall. She doesn't just do that, she waits for them to come to it. And on some level, they may pick up on that confidence that she has in them. It's a very hands-on lesson, but it's not just hands-on. It took me a little while to figure that out. There are many hands-on lessons that kids have that are not minds-on as well. I remember watching a 6th grade classroom once where the hands-on lesson was to glue bits of cotton balls onto pieces of paper while they memorized the types of clouds. That's not a mind-on lesson. These kids, there are teachers who would have prided themselves on first explaining what is standard units of measurement. You have to know that term. You're going to be quizzed about it. Here's what it means. Here's why it's so important. Now, because I'm a groovy teacher, here are some rulers. Go measure things. These kids were grappling with the idea of a ruler. They were, in effect, inventing or constructing the rationale for things like rulers. It is so much deeper than just telling kids things, making them memorize concepts, and then to make it a little more fun, have them do a little art project around it or something like that. And notice that she did ultimately introduce the concept of standard units of measurement, but only after the exploration and the discovery. The exploration and discovery is not the fun stuff. That's the real learning. That's far more powerful in a progressive classroom than simply having a term, a definition, a date, a skill to acquire. So I try to do this too when I talk to folks, which is start with the, at least imaginary, process of diving into the concrete example of this, and only then offering the abstractions, which is to say, the answers to the question, what is progressive learning? Why does it matter? And I want to do that part now in 3 ways, to suggest some of the things that characterize great progressive classrooms and schools that I have had the good fortune of visiting and watching all over the place. What tends to be present in these schools and classrooms? And in my experience, it's much more common to find an amazing classroom that reflects almost all of this than a whole school or district. And then second, I want to mention some of the mindsets that serve as barriers and end up derailing great progressive education, beliefs and ideas that we have. And then finally, and not least, what tends to be missing in great progressive schools and classrooms? Because what isn't there is as important, I think, as what is. So I'm just going to mention a few of these concepts. First of all, the positive ones, the things that drive great progressive classrooms and schools. And the first one I'll mention is lots of educators talk about the importance of kids' love of learning. I think I could break into an elementary school teacher's bedroom at 3 in the morning and shake her awake and say, "Quick, what's your long-term goal for the kids you teach?" And she would say, "A lifelong learners." And how did you get in my bedroom? In that order. In fact, often when I talk to parents about parenting, which I also write and speak about, or when I talk to teachers, I often begin by asking, what are your long-term goals for your children or your students? How would you like them to turn out? What would you like them to be like years from now? And I've done that activity hundreds of times, all over North America and beyond, in public and private schools, elementary and secondary, with administrators, teachers and parents, rural, urban and suburban, and you can imagine the kinds of answers I often get. More of them are about the kind of people that teachers want kids to be than just the kind of learners. They say things like happy, ethical, caring, independent, things like that. But when they turn to the lessons of having to do with the kind of learners, no teacher has ever said, my long-term goal is for kids to know how to convert a decimal into a fraction. Or the difference between a simile and a metaphor. They say things like, I want them to be problem solvers, curious, creative, critical thinkers, and the big triple L, lifelong learners. So that's cheap. A lot of people will say, I want kids to love learning, not just to know a bunch of stuff. The question, what separates the amazing teachers, schools, and school districts from the ones that just pay lip service to it is, are you willing to stop doing the things that research and practice prove get in the way of that? Because if there are some traditional practices that most schools and districts are doing that demonstrably make kids less excited about learning, then the question is, are you going to live up to what's on your website? Are you willing to say, then we have to stop doing that? And I'm going to mention a couple of those things toward the end as the things missing in progressive classrooms. But for now, the point is, the really amazing progressive educators mean it when they say we want kids, we don't want to destroy their curiosity. That's what drives their practice. That's the North Star that they navigate by. A second thing I tend to find in these schools and classrooms is that it's not primarily about what I call a bunch o' facts that is the goal here. It's not mostly just about a content-rich education, which is the current phrase used even more than core curriculum by the reactionaries who are mostly focused on a list of information. Content-rich? I mean, a phone book is content-rich. What progressive educators do is they focus not just on a bunch of facts or skills, but on deep understanding, on making sense of ideas from the inside out. That's a very different school. When meaning and engagement are present, you don't hear these schools talk about a rigorous education, where we're going to raise the bar. You know, rigorous, of course, calls to mind rigor mortis, and it basically just means it's going to be hard, more kids will fail, so we can say, look how we've raised the bars. By the way, that phrase, raising the bar, I'm pretty sure originated in the world of show horses. I wonder how many more times that's going to happen. Can we start a pool? Chair and chair alike. If raise the bar, The fact that that started with show horses tells you pretty much everything you need to know about the view of children on the part of people who talk like this. I have been to some rigorous schools that I wouldn't send my dog to. And conversely, I've been in some classrooms where I'm blown away by what's going on, and it's not primarily because it's really hard. You know, it's not just about the challenge level. And there are some parents who are used to complaining, well, my child who's reading at age 4, you know, can blow through the assignments too easily. He's not being challenged enough. You know, he can do the worksheet in 5 minutes. And I think about ways teachers could respond to that. They could say, how about if I give your kid 25 problems and they're much harder? You know, would the parent then say, are you making fun of me? Or would the parent say, would you? Thank you, I appreciate that. My guess is that all the kids are bored because she's given worksheets and all. The question isn't how many problems or how hard they are, and the more you focus on challenge level, the more you're missing what matters in terms of the quality of the learning. Does this matter? Does it answer questions that kids actually have? Does it engage them intellectually? It's a very different way, and unfortunately our public school systems, top-down, corporate-style, test-driven, it's not really about the quality of the learning. It's merely about raising the standards so we can raise kids who will out-compete their counterparts in other countries, which suggests that we want children who live in other countries not to learn well, which I find both morally and intellectually bankrupt. That's what happens when you have a Bill Gates design a system by a common core curriculum, because his interest is not in children's learning. His interest, like Democratic and Republican politicians alike, when they talk about education, is justified A, in terms of economics, not intellectual growth and what's best for children. And B, even worse, not just about economics, but about triumphing over people in other countries. It's not about excellence even, it's about winning. And those two are very different, which is a whole different evening. But the focus on not mere difficulty, but engagement is what we find in progressive schools. The idea that we are interested in helping them to think deeply, in a context and for a purpose. It's not that we don't teach knowledge and skills, it's that they're taught in a context and for a purpose. I don't care whether kids are good spellers. Spelling is just instrumental. A friend of mine likes to say, I don't care if they happen to be good spellers, I just want to make sure that they can edit their piece before it's released to the world so they're not embarrassed about how it looks. If they want to draw from a compendium of words they've memorized and rules, okay. A lot of smart people I know are not good spellers. So they turn to the person sitting next to them and say, how to spell that? Or they use spell check or a dictionary or something like that. I don't care. It's not about spelling mostly. If you make kids spell correctly, you mostly turn them off as writers. Same for vocabulary. Great progressive teachers would never give a list of words where they have to memorize the meanings of these words. And they would certainly never give the same list to all the kids in class. Because kids have different problems with different words. Would they ever give a list of words that isn't related to the very questions the kids have and the things that they're reading? No, because it's all integrated. If you start this stuff too early, if you emphasize this stuff too much, like vocabulary and spelling, and if you teach it too separately, you're not noting that these are mere skills in the service of rich literacy. Exactly the same is true in math. You don't teach addition, subtraction, multiplication, and division, the basic operations, so that kids will get good at doing what their phone or a calculator can do. This is just stuff that you do in the service of making mathematical meaning. So I'm not saying we don't want kids to do this. I mean, I will say, this is a little quiz I sometimes give to people, which most people get wrong, especially math teachers. And the quiz is, which is bigger, 3/7 or 9/22? And the correct answer is, who cares? Never forget that that's the correct answer to that question. Ball up and throw away a piece of paper that demands that you, with a bunch of naked numbers, that you answer questions like that. I'm not saying we don't learn fractions. I say in a context and for a purpose. And the purpose has to be to understand ideas having to do with mathematics. Worksheets are not about that. And overemphasizing the skills becomes extremely problematic. A friend of mine named Bruce, by email, sent me an email where he described something that happened when his daughter Rachel, who's in 5th grade, came home with a worksheet from her class, a worksheet on simple machines, you know, ball bearings, inclined planes, things like that, pulleys. And as I came in the door from work, she said, "Oh, Dad, test me, test me." Well, I said, "Why don't you just tell me what you've been learning about?" And she said, "Yeah, okay, but first ask me what these things are." "All right," he said, "if you insist. What is a ball bearing?" "Oh, easy, Dad. A ball bearing is a verbatim repetition of what the teacher or the book had taught her. And I said to her, yeah, but Rachel, what is a ball bearing?" I said, "I just told you, Dad. It's a So to make a long story short, I turned over the ottoman in our living room, which was on wheels, and I showed her the ball bearings. And she went, "Cool, that's what a ball bearing is? How does it work? Can we take apart the ottoman? I really want to look. Oh, I get it. Why didn't Mrs. Smith just tell us that this is what it was? Can you buy these things in the store? Where do they sell these things anyway? Hey, you want to help me make something that rotates? Hey, cool, watch what happens if I hold one of these and then try to spin this thing. That is so cool. What would happen to this thing if the balls were really big? Would the wheels spin as fast?" The learning didn't start until the totally useless school assignment was pushed aside. If a child is memorizing definitions, in this case, it's in a science lesson, that's not about thinking. And that's the kind of thing you find missing in great progressive classrooms. I don't just mean worksheets, let alone even worse, worksheets you have to do at night. I mean that the whole focus here is to see skills and knowledge as means to an end. It's about deep understanding. That's the second thing that tends to happen in these amazing classrooms. Third is, I try very hard to avoid education buzzwords, but there is one term in our field that I think every parent, certainly every educator, ought to know. And the word is constructivism, or constructivist, which is not actually a prescription for how to teach. It's a description of how people learn. And it's based on good, solid cognitive science, which says that human beings are not empty receptacles into which knowledge is poured. We are active meaning makers from our earliest days in all our lives. When my daughter Abigail was not even 2 years old, she had a theory about the sky, and it went as follows. The moon comes out at night. And I just echoed this back to her. You see the moon at night a lot. One day she had occasion to revisit that theory when out of a clear blue sky, literally, she saw the moon during the day. So she had to go back and reconstruct, reconsider what she had believed. This is what great teachers do all the time. They don't just feed kids information or have kids practice skills. They have kids make and remake sense of the way things work. The way writing works, not just the way the natural world works. Kids come in with theories about things, and then the real learning happens when they go, oh wait. Either the teacher calls to their attention that they have two different theories that are not actually compatible, or they have a theory that is challenged by a fact or an observation. This is how real astronomers work. They have a theory about what's in this quadrant of the universe until the Hubble telescope, free of atmospheric interference, shows that there's actually different stars there than they thought, and they have to go back and reconsider what they believed. Or third, that their theory comes into conflict with somebody else's theory, which is why it's so critical that the learning is interactive and collaborative. Because you don't get to be challenged by somebody else's theory if you're all alone on your own desk. It's only when you hear somebody else say, I thought the dinosaurs went extinct for another reason. Or, I didn't think the character in that story was selfish. You didn't? But didn't you see on page 48? That's where the learning comes from. It's active and it's interactive, but most importantly, it's about constructing meaning. That's what happens. It's intellectually rich, even in preschool, and certainly beyond in these classrooms. The next thing, and by the way, this is why the focus tends not to be on right answer production, even in math, where there are right answers, let alone in other fields. There was a period in my education career where I was teaching 9th grade English, and I wince when I think about how I taught, to be honest. I did it with lessons that might as well have been called Meet Mr. Semicolon, you know, our friend the adverb. And it was, I actually had them learning stuff for which there were right answers. What's the definition of a predicate? What is, as I mentioned before, the difference between a simile and a metaphor? I was teaching English, for God's sake. I would have been a much better teacher if there had been virtually nothing where they just had to memorize what iambic pentameter is. I turned it into, a trivia pursuit instead of an opportunity to make meaning. And that's what great teachers I've seen often do. The next thing we find in progressive classrooms is that the curriculum is not organized around facts or skills or separate disciplines, as in, put away your science books, now we're going to learn about literature. Or even more absurdly, put away your reading, now we're going to do spelling, which is almost a parody of itself in terms of its fragmentation, lack of wholeness and integration. But it's not organized around this stuff. The school day, the learning is organized around problems and projects and questions. Ideally, the questions that the kids themselves have. It's project-based almost all the time. And the teachers see themselves mostly as educators of students, not as teachers of chemistry or the arts. They're generalists, they're pedagogues, and they take responsibility for the learning that kids do. You start with a project and then you pull in what you need in order to make sense of these questions. I hope you become more proficient at thinking like a mathematician or a literary critic or a historian or an artist. But you don't mostly have these separate walled-off areas, even in the best high schools, where you don't do 47 minutes of Romeo and Juliet, only for the bell to ring, whereupon you salivate and move on to P and D orbitals. It doesn't work like that in progressive schools, which is about learning. What I've just described, that highly regimented, segmented, disciplinary approach, is part of why so many kids are so powerfully alienated from high school and see it as something to be gotten through as quickly as possible. And all they want to do when they get to these schools, especially traditional public high schools, is see their friends and do their extracurriculars because they get joy from singing or drama or a yearbook or whatever. But the learning, not so much. The more rigorous, sometimes private high schools are different only in the intensification of the same backwards thinking approach. It's more rigorous, but it is not more progressive or more meaningful. It is the difference between, this difference is key. I could have done it in a way, I could have come in and said the following. Our schools, especially for younger children, are too academic, but not nearly intellectual enough. I'm going home to discuss. That could have been it. That could have been the whole presentation. You know, there's this tendency to confuse the two. And there's great stuff on preschool and kindergarten, by the way, what makes an intellectually vibrant preschool. And it's not about making the kids learn their colors and their numbers. It's not about that. It's not about having them, ready in time for our lockstep standardized curriculum, where now in public schools, the average kindergarten looks nothing like the child's garden that the word originally meant. It looks like a really bad first grade. It's more rigorous, and it's turning kids off to learning much earlier than used to be the case. The next thing I find in progressive schools is a sense of community, of connection. It's not just that the kids do cooperative learning in pairs or small groups, although they do that in progressive schools most of the time. Sometimes it's doing stuff on their own, sometimes whole class, but most of the time in small groups, learning with and from one another. And there's tutoring that goes on, but there's also buddy systems where older kids and younger kids in the school regularly spend time together, which is such an amazing thing. I cannot understand why any school doesn't do that. Where there's this sense of a community, both within the school, where the kids feel safe and a sense of belonging, and in the individual classroom, which you might be able to imagine now what are some of the things that are absent in those schools because they kill community. The last thing I want to mention in this first part of what I find, although I actually have a longer list, is the topic that I spoke to some of you about this afternoon, which is that the best classrooms and schools give kids a lot of say about what they're doing, not just individually, but as a whole class. Because, and I hope those of you who were with me this afternoon will pardon just a minute of repetition, kids learn to make good decisions by making decisions, not by following directions. When I speak to parents, I use that same line and talk about what we can do at home to bring kids in on making decisions about their lives rather than controlling them. The first step is to stop doing things that are controlling, that are doing to, especially punishments. Do this, or here's how I'm going to make you suffer, which we prefer to call consequences, because it makes us feel better about making kids feel terrible. Or the flip side of punishments, rewards. Do this and you'll get that. Stickers, gold stars, dessert, special privileges, or a verbal doggy biscuit. Good job. This is not about helping kids to grow. This is about getting kids to do whatever they're told. The first step is to move past this doing-to approach, either by bribe or threat. But the next step is to proactively and affirmatively work with kids by inviting them to play more of a role in deciding what happens in their lives. The best teachers and the best parents do a hell of a lot more asking than telling. And I don't just mean asking loaded questions where there's one right answer. I mean asking questions where the grown-up doesn't really know what the kid's going to say. And inviting the kids to participate in a developmentally appropriate way in making choices where the kid's idea might make us uncomfortable. Because if we're not inviting them to participate in making decisions where we might gulp a little at what they propose, we're not giving them real choices. They're a little too safe, and they're not supporting the kids' autonomy. John Dewey said, in the typical school, the center of gravity is outside the child. It's in the rules that were there before the kid entered the school and that the kids had nothing to say about. It's in the curriculum, in the textbook, in the lecture, in the teacher. It's anywhere but in the kid. In the progressive school, the center of gravity is with the child, where we adapt to what the kids need. I walk into a school, I smell the air, I look at the walls, I ask people questions if they're around, and I try to get a sense of whether this is the kind of place where the primary question animating the adults is, how do we get these kids to do what we're telling them? To show up on time, sit down, and do the learning. Because they don't all do that. Some of them push back. How do we get them to comply? As opposed to the kind of school where the question in the air is, what do these children need? And how can we meet those needs? It almost doesn't even matter what you think the answer is to those respective questions. How you think you can get them to show up and sit down and shut up and so on. And if you can do it more nicely. Or what you think the kids need. What matters is which question is driving everybody. And there's a lot of schools that see themselves as enlightened in various ways, but they tend to be pulled back by an undertow of traditionalism in our society. And pretty soon, they're just a lot cleverer and more personable in the way they elicit compliance. But that's still really what's going on. There's not a lot of student-centered ideas and problem solving that's going on. And really, that is what happens. The best teachers go, ooh, why did I decide this today when I could have brought the kids in on deciding it instead? I have loads of examples, but some of you were kind enough to sit through them already once today, and I don't want to belabor those. For kids of all ages, where amazing classrooms have been constructed around ways of helping the kids to decide together. So let me move on to the second part, where I have found that there is a couple of belief systems or assumptions, a kind of residual loyalty to old ways of thinking that make it really hard to create the kind of classrooms and schools characterized by the stuff that I just listed. And I want to mention very quickly 5 belief systems. And then I'm going to tell you what's missing in the school, and then let's talk. Let's take advantage of how few of us there are here so we can have a real conversation. So the first thing that I find gets in the way is standardization. A belief that it makes sense to deliver pretty much the same kind of curriculum to all the kids. In a progressive school, if I'm teaching fourth graders, and you're a fourth grade teacher down the hall, of course our curriculum is not going to be the same. We have different kids. If it's pretty much the same in its particulars, there's a real problem here. Talk about the center of gravity being outside the child. Similarly, my fourth grade class this year is going to have a pretty different curriculum than my own fourth grade class did last year for the same reason. So when you standardize, you dumb down the curriculum. Everybody deserves a great education, but that's not the same as saying all kids deserve the same education. And unfortunately, that confusion of high quality with standardized learning is what drives New York education policy and most of other states and the Common Core curriculum when they attempted to go national with it. That one size fits all, you know, if you're in this grade, you're going to learn long division. If you're in this grade, you're going to learn what a Venn diagram is. If you're in this grade, you're going to learn about rocks and minerals every damn year, and you have nothing to say about it. Indeed, the teacher has nothing to say about it. This is a textbook case of how not to help children become lifelong learners or deep thinkers. So the first thing is any residual commitment to standardization kills the quality of learning. The second thing that does is putting more emphasis on how well kids are doing and getting them to think about that, taking their own temperature, as opposed to a focus on what kids are doing. This is a really critical difference. And I'm summarizing a great deal of research in educational psychology, where a lot of people have found that when you get kids thinking about what level of academic achievement they're at, they're not so much engaged with the learning itself. I ask teachers of kids who are like 5, 6, 7 years old, do you want kids to, when they read a story, to mostly be thinking about the story and their reaction to it, or to be thinking about how good they are as readers? Because if you choose option A, you would not be doing all this metacognitive garbage with little post-its on it and a constant attention to their own reading skills. You would not be pushing them to develop a phonics fetish, where it's all about the, which is spelled P-H-E-T-I-S-H, of course. Imagine a kid who walks into a classroom. What's her goal today? The goal of figuring out why this liquid can get so incredibly cold and still not freeze. Or the goal of figuring out why trouble always in history seems to break out in the Balkans. Or the goal of figuring out why this character in the story we read left home at the end, even though he didn't seem to be unhappy. Those are learning goals. But some children have been trained to walk into the classroom, so their goal is going to be to get an A. Their goal is to get the teacher to say, very good, to get a gold star. Those are not learning goals. Those are performance goals. And the research finds that the more you get kids focused on their achievement, their performance, how well they're doing, the less they tend to be interested in the learning itself. That's a critical difference. Imagine an older kid who writes an essay and talks about it with the parents at home at dinner. I wrote an essay today. What's the parents' first question? Is it, how did you decide what to write about? Assuming you're lucky enough to have a teacher who lets you decide. Or, did your ideas about this change while you were writing? Or did you pretty much already know what you were going to say before you started? Those are generative, interesting questions. But as we know, many parents have a very different question. It's, what did the teacher think? What grade did you get? Is it better than what you were doing before? Those are deeply anti-intellectual questions. The problem is not just grades, because you can do grade substitutes which some schools do. Like instead of we don't give you A, B, C, D, F, we do working toward the goal, meeting the standard, exceeding or greatly exceeding, which is just grades by a different name. You can do any kind of assessment in such a way where kids are constantly taking their own temperature. They're like, it reminds me of you, do some of you remember Ed Koch, the mayor of New York City? Late 70s or early 80s, tall, bald-headed guy. He used to wander, this was his thing. He would wander the streets of New York, stopping hapless passersby and say, how am I doing? How am I doing? How am I doing? Which he apparently thought was endearing, as opposed to deeply neurotic. We don't want to turn kids into little Ed Koches, is my point, which is a frightening image. The third thing that I think gets in the way of progressive education is quantification. Please don't ask me that if we get rid of grades and tests, how will we measure the quality of students' learning or teachers' teaching? Wrong verb. I'm happy to answer the question, how do we assess learning and teaching? But when you reduce it to numbers, which we do in any number of ways, we tend to dumb down the learning. It is easier to measure the number of times a kid uses a comma correctly in an essay than it is to measure the number of wonderful ideas in the essay. So the more focused you are on data-driven instruction, the more trivial your teaching becomes. The best kinds of learning. My favorite quote here is from a professor at Rice University in Houston named Linda McNeil, who said, measurable outcomes may be the least significant results of learning. I swear, if I saw that quote printed out in 42-point Helvetica and framed in a principal's office, that's all I would need to see to say, I want my kid to go here. I'm going to predict that a lot of other great things are there. But what I worry about are the administrators who actually become the accomplices of politicians who know less about learning than they do by forcing a data-driven approach and reducing learning to numbers. That makes it very, very hard to teach in the way that makes sense. Number 4 is an overemphasis on rigor, but I already said enough about that, so I'll move on to my 5th one, which is something I call the GOODY, which is a really silly acronym that stands for Better Get Used to It. So the question is, why in the world would you have little children doing stuff that has no conceivable value and just turns them off to learning? I'm going to give you 2 examples in a minute. And the only answer when you present them with the research that it has no beneficial effect is that they're going to get this stuff when they get to middle school. Or in middle school when they get to high school, or in high school when they get to college. So we better start destroying their interest in learning with pointless stuff while they're young. Nobody says it like that. But they come surprisingly close with no chance of irony animating what they're saying. How many people have you... The research shows that this is bad for children and does them no good. Well, you know, this reminds me of the old Monty Python sketch. Have any Python fans here at all? Do any of you remember the one called Getting Hit on the Head Lessons? Guy walks into a room, and the guy meets the fellow in the room, immediately bangs him over the head. Ow! No. Don't hold your head like this. Hold it like that. Try and say whack. Try it again. Ah! Better. Why are you hitting me? This is getting hit on the head lessons. Which is excellent preparation for being hit on the head later. And that's what a lot of elementary school is like. And not just elementary school. And when it gets really dark and much less funny, and I don't think about Monty Python, I just want to weep, is where parents and teachers overvalue failure. Believe that, skinned knees are good for you because you brush yourself off and say, by golly, I'm gonna be even more resilient next time that I've experienced this failure or this setback, which is more utopian than any progressive educator ever was. Because that's not, in fact, what tends to happen. When kids fail, they tend to come to believe that they themselves are failures and are less likely to succeed next time as compared to the students who succeed in the beginning on tasks that are meaningful to them. I don't mean getting a quiz, getting 100 on a quiz. I mean stuff that matters to them. But the point is that there are parents who deliberately want kids to experience natural consequences, which basically teaches kids, Mom or Dad could have helped me and didn't. That's the main message they take away from that. Why is it? Because they don't love me that much? Because I'm not worthy of it? I don't know. But that's what I'm really thinking about, is they could have helped but didn't. Well, the parent is thinking, teach the kid to be self-reliant, which is at odds with everything we know in developmental psychology. So with raising kids, we're teaching kids. One of the things that gets in the way of good practice is believing that you have to do pointless, unpleasant things to kids when they're young to prepare them for the bad stuff that happens later, which makes about as much sense as saying there are many carcinogens in the environment, so we should feed cancer-causing agents to children as young as possible. Makes about the same amount of sense. So finally, let me rattle off some things that I breathe a sigh of relief when I don't see in a classroom or school. And the first thing is textbooks. If I see them, they're on a shelf with the other reference sources to be consulted as needed for a project, along with other sources of information. What you do not see in a progressive school ever is a textbook that becomes the curriculum, and they crawl through it chapter by agonizing chapter. Here's my favorite story about textbooks. A 6th grade teacher in a public school was handed a bunch of textbooks or workbooks in science by her principal, and she said, "Thank you very much," and she put them in the closet and continued having kids do science, not memorize facts about science by themselves. And they're always doing stuff and learning and figuring out ratios and all the rest of it. And one day the principal came in and looked around, big smile, and then, as Jimmy B. Jones says, the smile ran away from his face. And principal calls the teacher over for a hurried conference and said, what happened to the workbooks I gave you? And the teacher said, "Oh, they're fine, they're safe, they're in the closet." I said, "No, it's not good enough, you have to use them." "We have to use them?" "You have to use them." And she reported, "We used them. We weighed them dry, and we weighed them wet." It's my favorite story about a correct use of textbooks. The second thing you do not find in progressive classrooms very much, or progressive schools, is one of the things I've been sort of coyly hinting at. That's the first of the two examples of what destroys curiosity and interest. Progressive schools that have their act together never give grades, letter or numbers or grade substitutes. Nor do they do grades on steroids, which are called rubrics, thinking that's authentic assessment. It just multiplies the damage, giving more numbers on more criteria within a subject matter. The research about grades I have read, I don't want to boast, but I think I've read every study ever conducted on the difference in effect on giving kids grades and not giving them grades at all. The reason I'm not boasting is there aren't that many of these studies. There should be more, but unfortunately, most of the studies on grades are grading this way versus grading that way, because the premise is, well, you gotta get grades, it's just a question of how you do it. But when we challenge this assumption, and this typical study is done by having all the kids get the same assignment, kids of the same age, and they're randomly distributed into two groups. And the first group just gets the assignment here, see if you can figure this out, and those in the second group are told, here, see if you can figure this out, and this will count for a grade. It's the only difference. And then they collect. And what they find are 3 differences on average, not for every kid, but on average. Number 1, kids who get grades are less interested in whatever they were learning now. Less interested in this topic, less interested in the whole subject matter, like math or writing, and less interested in learning. Now, if you're one of those teachers or parents who wants kids to be lifelong learners, you already have reason to make sure you never give grades. To the best of my knowledge, every study that has ever been done on that question, from elementary school to college, has found a diminution in intrinsic motivation. That is to say, excitement about the learning itself, when they are given grades. It doesn't matter if they get high grades or low grades. It doesn't matter how easy or difficult it was to get a certain grade. What matters is if they were graded at all. Standards-based grading is something that helped me understand the old phrase, lipstick on a pig, in a way I had never understood before. Standards-based grading does nothing to address the inherent problems of grades per se. The second result, according to these studies, is that kids who get grades tend to pick the easiest possible task if they're given a choice. You give them a bunch of books, they pick the shortest one. You give them different projects, they pick the one they're already familiar with. Not because the kids lack a growth mindset, which is a great way of blaming the kids for the structure problem. Not because they're lazy or cutting corners, but because they're rational. Duh! If the point in here is to get a good report card, then obviously the easier the thing I'm doing, the better the chance that I can do what you seem to want. Which is not intellectual risk-taking, it's intellectual risk avoidance. Don't blame the kids for being grade grubbers. Don't blame the kids for cutting corners. The problem is we're giving them grades. And sometimes we take a bad thing and make it even worse by putting the grades online. Oh my God! It's not poisonous enough. You have to make it more salient. You have to push it into the kids and the parents' faces. Or putting grades up on the wall in the classroom. The more you make them think about it, the more damage you do to their learning and interest in learning. And preference for challenge. And the third effect, according to the research, is whenever you give grades, or anything that resembles a grade, kids will think in more shallow and superficial ways. They are more likely to ask questions like, do we need to know this? Is it going to be on the test? As opposed to what kids in more progressive classrooms, same kids, are likely to ask, which is, but doesn't that kind of contradict what we were talking about last week? Why would that be true? Those are the kinds of questions that even really smart kids become less interested in if anybody ever suggests there's a grade involved. If you are unlucky enough to be a parent whose kid is in a traditional school that still gives grades, your job is to do everything you can to make grades as invisible as possible. Do not even look at the report card, or don't make a big deal about it. If you really want to destroy his interest, reward them for good grades, or punish them for bad grades. Now you're rewarding them for being rewarded. You're doubling down on the damage. The damage in terms of interest, the damage in terms of preference for challenge, and the damage in terms of quality of thinking. If you're a teacher who works in a system where you have to give grades, your job too is to do everything possible in the short run to help kids forget that grades exist. Because if you put grades on their individual assignments, you're now part of the problem and can't just blame the administration. Never put a letter or number on anything a kid ever does if you want them to be a lifelong learner. And that's not just something I thought of this morning in the shower. That's based on hard evidence about the inherently damaging effect of all grades, which is why the best schools do not give grades. That's not to say they don't offer information to parents about how the kids are doing. Although hopefully they don't allow the focus on how they're doing to eclipse the more important information about what they're doing. But they do it in sometimes in qualitative narratives, but better than that, they do it in conversations. You know why a conference with a parent and a kid is better than a narrative report? Because there's the possibility, hypothetically at least, of it being a dialogue. A narrative report is still a monologue, although it's a hell of a lot better and more meaningful than a B+. Here's the next thing we tend not to find in great classrooms, progressive schools, is tests and quizzes. Tests, there's some research going back about 50 years showing that the teachers who were evaluated and assessed to be the highest quality teachers by a bunch of criteria never gave tests, even in high school. And I think that was true for two reasons. One is because they didn't need to. They were getting a constant source of information by watching and listening and talking with the kids, sitting by them. That's what the word assess means. It comes from the Latin meaning. To assess is to sit near, sit alongside. You see how they solve the math problem, not just whether they get the right answer, and you read with them. This is harder to do if you have too many kids. It's harder to do under a lot of circumstances in many schools, of course. But the tests don't provide information that you can't already get. If you have kids just sitting there listening most of the time, then you have no idea how they think. So the problem is partly the way this has been organized. The other reason that they don't give tests is because tests are mostly telling you about how many forgettable facts have been squeezed into short-term memory. What else don't I find? I don't find tracking and gifted programs that segregate kids by alleged ability, offering the kinds of enrichments that all kids would benefit for only to a thin slice, and often a disproportionately affluent and white slice of the student population. You don't find progressive schools, when kids do stuff that's really troubling, it's seen as an opportunity for working with, for solving the problem. You would never find these schools doing things like detentions, internal or external, timeouts, which is a euphemism for forcible isolation of kids when they need us most. You don't find other things where we take away, give them a bad grade, send a nasty note home to the parent, yell at them, and so on. Nor do you find dreadful programs that are about mass training as if they were pets, with names like Positive Behavior Support, PBIS, or Class Dojo, where training kids like pets goes high tech. You don't find stickers and gold stars and special privileges, special parties and recess held back until kids obey us and then given to them as a reward. We're not raising, house training puppies. We're teaching and raising children. So you don't find any variation on this kind of classroom management or school-wide discipline programs. Progressive schools also tend not to set kids against each other. They would never, never have awards. The only thing worse than a reward is an award. You see the difference? An award is a reward that has been made artificially scarce, so that if you get one, I can't. All award, the problem is not just which awards we give, or maybe we should give honorable mentions. Maybe we should give awards for spelling as well as for athletics. No, anytime kids learn that they can be successful only at the price of other people's failure, which is built into contests of any kind, you destroy the possibility of creating a caring community. And so you would never find competitive games, outdoors or indoors, but cooperative games where everybody has to pull together to figure out how to do this stuff and have a great time while they're at it. Nor would you ever single out certain kids in public as having done better than other kids, which is not just bad because it makes the losers feel bad, it's destructive to the winners too, because they too see themselves as successful only by triumphing over everybody else. And they're only as good as their last trophy. The idea that what's wrong these days, this reactionary talking point, that we now give trophies out for everything, just for participating, just for showing up, that right-wing narrative overlooks the fact that trophies are far more dangerous when we restrict them to just winners. Because the whole activity is not about everyone succeeding. It's about beating everyone else. And there's a whole lot of research on the destructive effects of that. I'm just going to mention one more, my last one, and then take your responses and questions and challenges to this. The last one is the other example of the common activity that has no place in a school that's serious about lifelong learning. It really wants kids to love what they're doing. One activity that reliably kills excitement about learning is grades. The other one, according to research and, if we're honest, experience, is making kids work what amounts to a second shift when they get home from a full day in school. This is an hour-and-a-half talk in its own right. I wrote a whole book about it, which makes a fabulous gift. But I will just now point out the following. No controlled study, to the best of my knowledge, has ever found any benefit to any kind or amount of homework below the high school level. If a child is assigned homework of any kind in 7th grade, let alone, God help us, 2nd grade, that is not best practice. The most charitable explanation is the educators weren't aware that it is literally all pain and no gain. There is no benefit to making a middle schooler do any homework, let alone in elementary school. And newer, better research questions whether it's even useful in high school. I'd be glad to talk to you more about those studies if you want. We all know the downside of homework: frustration, exhaustion, family conflict, parents having to nag kids. First thing they ask kids after seeing all day, did you do your homework? How sad is that? That's the first thing. Kids who become less excited about learning, who don't have enough time to do things, that we know the downside. The amazing thing is there is literally no upside for this. No benefit to the homework. When you show the research to people who are proponents of homework, to parents who actually, in some cases, the teachers will tell you, demand it even though the teacher knows better. Although I also hear from many parents who know that this makes no sense, and they see their child's excitement about reading evaporating when the child is told you have to read 20 minutes tonight, or you have to read this many pages. That kills their interest in reading. It used to be something they wanted to do. Now it's like brushing their teeth. How long do I have to do it for? You've turned it into something tedious, a prerequisite. The parents write to me saying, can you talk some sense into the teachers? The teachers write to me saying, can you talk some sense into the parents? And people tend to push for it. And if you show them the research, there's no academic benefit, they fall back on claiming, well, there's non-academic benefit. It develops independence, self-reliance, good work habits, etc., etc. I would describe that as an urban myth collectively, except for the fact that it's a pretty popular myth in the suburbs too. And there is no study, to the best of my knowledge, that has ever supported any of those beliefs. So, in real progressive schools, they don't just say, well, we don't start homework until 3rd grade. Or they don't say we limit it to X number of minutes. They say Of course we're not going to reach the long arm of the school into the home and tell them what they have to do when they're not in school. We don't do that. We don't do it because it's disrespectful, it's institutional arrogance, and we don't do it because there's no benefit to it, according to research, and we don't do it because we meant it when we say, job one is preserving and nourishing their excitement about learning. We meant it, so we will never give a grade, we will never give homework. Now, I didn't just do my whole talk on the what not to do's, but the what not to do's are as important as the what to do's. I am so pleased to be able to tell you that progressive education, which many people thought 100 years ago was just a nicer way of helping kids learn, also has a solid research tradition behind it. The more ambitious your goals for kids' intellectual development, the more they will benefit from a school that looks like what I've been describing. Questions? Objections? Please, ask me anything. Yes?
Okay, so knowing that
Yeah.
the majority of the schools, except for one that I know of, that the host would be, that we've had this tradition of all the things you said not to do.
Right.
So how do you switch it, or if somebody's been going through this since, up until the 4th or 5th grade, can you just turn it off, or, how do you transition and?
Right. Yeah, that's a logical and important question. And I think answering it starts by asking the question, if what I'm saying is true, and progressive education is so beneficial, why the hell is it so rare? We have to understand what the barriers are in order to make a plan for making change. Do you have any thoughts? Why do you think traditional education, including things like grades and tests and textbooks and competition and punishments and rewards and too much emphasis on skills and all the rest of it, and kids having very little to say about what they're learning, why does that persist? Why is it so popular? Yeah?
Cultural inertia.
Inertia, okay. Now, that's an interesting hypothesis, because if that's true, then if everybody was all progressive, that too would have inertia, and we would stick with that, even if we had evidence against it. Do that thought experiment in your head. Is that how much of it is just because we've already always done it that way, and how much of it is that there are certain characteristics, features specific to traditional versus progressive education, that push in the direction of more traditional? Why do I see an undertow where progressive schools are constantly having to do this rearguard action against being sucked into being traditional? And I don't see much the other way, with traditional schools being sucked into being progressive. Not to dismiss the inertia explanation, but my guess is there's something else going on specific to why the bad stuff persists and the good stuff is so rare. I mean, I have some ideas, but I would be interested in yours too, if you have them. So, yeah.
I think when people look at their kids' future success or achievement, whether you're going to inhibit it by not giving them a traditional education.
And then that raises the interesting question of what constitutes success in your mind?
I think in this country, it's maybe.
Yeah, okay. So the more conventional and materialistic and competitive your goals are for your kid, the more likely you are to insist on the kind of education for your kid that leads toward those goals. Anything else would be seen as, well, that sounds pleasant, but is it going to make my kid, right? And that's why I start, when I talk to a group of parents, I start by asking them, what are your long-term goals for your kids? And nobody says, anywhere in the country, to have a summer house in the Hamptons. Nobody ever says to have a Jaguar, and for my kid to, be able to go to Vail every. When you ask people to think seriously about their goals for their children, they tend to say the stuff that I rattled off before. And so my job, I figured out some time ago, is to say to people, you say you want this, so why are you doing that? Because here's the research to show that if you want kids to be lifelong learners and critical thinkers and so on, textbooks and grades and so on get in the way. If you want kids to be decent, human, compassionate people, you don't praise them for being generous. That makes them less generous. Every time you say, good job, you shared your toy, the kid becomes a little more self-centered according to research. So here's the research. How serious were you about the goal? And now we'll go for the thoughts about, is there any other reason you think that traditional education persists besides the goals? Yeah.
It's easier. It's easier to teach.
It's
easier to measure.
Definitely easier, yes.
Easier to measure. It's easier to.
Easier to measure if you want to measure it.
It's easier to discipline, keep kids in line if there's a certain expectation. It's just more controllable.
You're right, and that last part actually, there was a really interesting piece that I saw a few years ago that said that, and I hadn't thought about it. It's we claim that we use traditional discipline to get kids on task, doing things like worksheets and so on. But you suggested, if I understood you correctly, the reverse, which I think is absolutely right and not often appreciated. The kind of assignments given to kids, the reason they're given things like worksheets, memorizing vocabulary words and so on, is because it makes it easier when they're doing that to make them compliant. As opposed to when you have an open-ended student design project-based approach where there's more noise, you know? And there's more kids going, yeah, but does this make sense? And so on. Maybe compliance is driving it.
And there's more things for teachers to pay attention to. You see more of your child's personality.
Yes.
You see more of who that child is.
That's
You
right.
have more factors to.
More complexity, absolutely. So, to come back to your original question, with more of an understanding of what's getting in the way, we need to systematically address the things, keeping in practice what doesn't make sense. And as superintendents, as principals or school heads, as teachers, as parents, as authors, we each have different points of entry into being able to help bring other people along to educate them about this. If anything I said tonight, or anything that I say in my books and articles, is useful to you in changing other people's minds, steal it. That's what it's there for. A study, a story, a turn of phrase, make it your own. Use it. But my overall response is we have to move on 2 tracks at once. In the short run, minimize the damage of the status quo, while simultaneously in the long run, moving to change the system itself. Take grades, for example. If I'm teaching in a school or school system where they're giving grades, in the short run, I never put a number grade or letter grade on individual assignments. Make grades as invisible as possible for as long as possible, even though I have to turn one in at the end. The second way as an individual teacher with grades, I can minimize the damages. They're forcing me to turn in a grade at the end of the term, but they never said I had to decide on that grade by myself. So I talk to each kid for a bit about the meaningful stuff, and then at the end say, I have to turn in a grade for you, what should it be? And let the kid pick the grade. But while I'm doing that stuff to minimize the harm, those stopgap measures, I'm organizing, buddy. I'm mobilizing. I'm moving up the ladder so that I don't have to be swimming upstream, if I can switch metaphors, so that we stop giving grades altogether and switch to more authentic assessments. And we make sure the parents understand the reason. Because there'll be resistance, and if you switch, if you're a superintendent and you say starting next year, only comments, no grades, you'll have your head handed to you. And you should, because if you're going to move from a doing to a working with, you don't do that transition to people. You bring them in. It's a multi-year process of collaborating and consulting and showing them videos and sharing articles about it and bringing them to see how incredibly intellectually vibrant and ultimately successful the kids are in places where they don't get grades. And what's true of grades is true for all the other crap that I've been talking about. Another couple of questions. I'll try to, you ask them concisely, I'll try to answer more concisely. Anything else you didn't get or you didn't buy? Yeah.
I'm a parent.
Okay.
Can you just give me a real simple, from a simple definition of progressive as the terminology you're using it?
I gave you an hour and a half one.
But I'd like that to be a little more focused.
It makes sense in a way that there isn't a simple, agreed-upon definition of progressive education, a fixed or top-down notion of what it consists in. In a way, it would be ironic if there were, and I find that my fellow progressive educators often disagree about some aspects. In some places, there's much more emphasis on each individual child, and other progressive educators are much more focused on collaboration on the community part. Doesn't mean that each of them rules out the other, it's a matter of emphasis. In some places, they talk about kids' work to be done, like the Montessori people do that. Others have as well, so do the Reggio Emilia folks but then other people say it's not work, why are we using metaphors from adults in factories? That's not what it is. Some talk a lot about it's the process that matters, not the outcome. But other progressive educators are really interested in the products that kids end up creating at the end. So there's these tensions and so on. But overall, it tends, I find, to be distinguished by an overwhelming respect for the child. That Deweyan notion of the center of gravity being in the kid. So for me, what I think runs across many different strands of progressive education, both historically and now, is some combination of the kids are driving the learning and making important decisions about it individually and collectively. They're learning collaboratively, not alone, and certainly not competitively. They're organizing it around problems, questions, and projects. And it's about deep thinking, not merely about rigor. I think those are the aspects. Now, there are other things too. It took me a while to realize that some schools that call themselves progressive are just culturally and politically progressive, and they call the teachers by their first name, and everybody hates the Republicans, and we're all about diversity and inclusion and saving the planet, but they still get worksheets. I've been in a lot of schools like that, and it took me a while to realize, it's easy to say in one sentence, being politically progressive, culturally progressive, and what you eat, what you wear, doesn't necessarily mean you're educationally progressive. And in other schools, progressive education is about making a difference in the world. Learning doesn't stop at the classroom door, or even in the farms surrounding the classrooms. That this is about going out and making a difference, and it's about more than just your verbal and mathematical intelligences, but the whole child. You've heard that phrase? For some people, that's the paramount goal of progressive education. It's a matter of emphasis. I wrote an article called Progressive Education, which covers a lot of this stuff. It's on my website if you want. But there's something, especially for you hayground folks and others who consider yourselves progressive, that you might find interesting at the end of that article, which is a dozen questions for progressive educators, which is about challenges for, is there some way in which maybe over time you've slipped and your practice isn't quite as progressive as it used to be or as you think it is. But the article itself offers some of the same stuff that I've been saying more concisely. Anything else? Yes?
How, as a high school junior in a traditional public school, how can you take that to your advantage and thrive in that environment?
Yeah. I get students writing to me all the time, and I don't write, here's what to do as a student, because you typically don't get to make the decisions about the policy issues that make this hard, and it becomes a matter of just helping you figure out how to put a clothespin on your nose and get through it. And try to minimize the pressure to, sign up for too many AP courses or not sign up for photography, which you love, or whatever, because you need the extra point if you sign up for a more difficult course, and to ask you, how much does it matter? Mostly I want to talk to your teachers and parents, and because I think it's not your fault. Do most of your reading outside class if you're not getting stuff that's worth reading inside class, and figure out how much time you're willing to devote to this. What I want to say to your parents is the right question to ask of a high school student who's your child is how much of their soul and their intellectual vibrancy are you willing to sacrifice so that your kid has a slightly better chance of getting into a more prestigious university that they may not get into anyway, and that may not be markedly better intellectually speaking than other schools. You know, the vast majority of universities and colleges in this country admit most of their applicants, and some of them are terrific. But it's like we only know about 100 of these places. The name brand, selective, prestigious, expensive, we shouldn't call them selective. The term that I prefer that I saw on Twitter was the highly rejected colleges, which is much more accurate. And those colleges are not necessarily better except for bragging ability on the part. They're not even necessarily better in terms of your lifelong income, assuming money is your primary objective, which I hope to heaven it isn't for your parents. But how much damage are you willing to do to your child to keep that GPA up so that there will be more interest by Columbia or Wesley Brown or Stanford and so on, when there's, assuming your child even wants to go right into college, many, many other places that will be happy to have that child and have that child intact. And by the way, I've offered many times to write a letter for high schools that get rid of grades, free of charge, ghostwriting, that goes into every kid's folder, that explains why our students are uniquely capable of taking full advantage of college education precisely because they've not been grade grubbers, because there are no grades to grub. And the most powerful predictor of getting a lot out of college is intact, intrinsic motivation. Nobody's killed your curiosity. So to that extent, it's not just nicer to you to move in the direction that I'm talking about. It's actually more productive. In the meantime, if sometimes you think you are not getting enough sleep or enough chance to do the things that give you joy, or seeing the friends who you enjoy being with, if your stress level is rising and you say, yeah, do your worst, I'm not doing this homework, or I'm only going to put in this much time to studying for your Lincoln test, and so on. I can't presume to tell you where to make those trade-offs. All I can do is say, don't be a mindless drone who forgets what gives you pleasure. That's what really keeps me up at night, is all the kids who can't even remember what they enjoy because they've been too busy, forced into pretending to be somebody for their teachers, or in sad cases also their parents, who they're not, in order to please the adults and impress them. So keep your eye on what matters and be willing, hopefully with the support of your parents, to not be pulled aside into overvaluing the conventional rewards and criteria for success. And then become a teacher and change the system. Anything else? Yeah.
I just was curious, student-driven at a grade, I imagine in a classroom, especially with younger kids, there's a broad number of interests.
Yes.
So how do you direct a child to be interested in something that they don't know about? It might be fascinating if they were open to it, but maybe they lack the curiosity to
Yes.
learn.
I'm not a proponent of laissez-faire, free schools where kids do always what they want and then just call on the adult for help when they're ready. I think there are too many opportunities missed, and that adults can often creatively complicate things, not just in the way they do a task, like our Mayflower math lesson teacher, but in terms of helping kids become exposed to things they didn't even know interested them. And I think it's really powerful when that happens. When teachers get to know kids well individually, they're able to connect something the kid didn't know about to something the kid's already interested in. I happen to know that you love everything that's about horses or motorcycles or whatever, now let me suggest this. And I think that is really powerful. When kids feel known and cared about, they give a lot more leeway to the teachers when they make a suggestion for a book or a project or an idea. Try this out. Look at this website. You know, I think you're gonna be very interested in it. And if you're not, then I'm wrong. Tell me, give me some feedback. It'll help me refine my recommendations. And to some extent, it is possible to do class-wide projects that have elements of different interests. And some kids are always going to be more interested in this than that. But they'll have a chance to taste something that they haven't had that possibility of. But if the unexpected and unrequested topic is introduced to them, it should be done in the context of a respectful student-centered environment that's collaborative, where the kid gets to decide how much of this to do and when and so on. So in other words, if you're going to presume to push kids to do something they didn't ask for, compensate by really doubling down on the autonomy support and opportunity to choose about every other aspect of that interaction. How that plays out with little kids and big kids in different disciplines is too detailed to get into now, so those are my generalizations. And I and many other people have written more detailed answers to those questions, focusing on specific age groups and areas of study. Much more on my website, alfiekohn.org. Loads of articles for free and info about books if you want. And all my books have enormous bibliographies where I point you to the people I've learned from, as well as not just studies, but stories of classrooms that I visited where the people get it astonishingly right, I think. The old folks, the Deweys and the Piagets, and the Jerry Bruners and others, but also the contemporary people who I think are absolutely astonishing. There's a whole world out there, and it's great when parents as well as educators open. Thank you so much for your coming and your openness to the